Hello, my name's Viv Richards, and today I want to talk to you about how we as teams can start the test sooner when it comes to APIs. Typically, you may assume that you need an API in place to be able to start to make requests and receive responses and to test the various states that an API could be in. Well, today we're going to be looking at Postman and we're going to be seeing how we can start to use mocks to our advantage. So let's head over to Postman and take a closer look. So within Postman, we can either click on New and click on Mock Server, or we can just go on Mock Servers on the left hand side and click on Create Mock Server. So we're going to just create a simple GET request first, and we're going to call this just ping. So when we call the URL ping for a mock endpoint, we want to return 200, and we'll just return OK in the body. Next, we'll click on Next, and we'll call this mock server test flicks. And we will say save the mock server URL as a new environment variable, and we'll click on create mock server. So now if we go to collections, we can see we've got a new collection called test flicks with a new request called ping, and this is showing red unresolved variable. So at the top, what we can do is we can click on environments and click on test flicks, and then you'll see the URL is becoming orange. So on the left as well, we can also click on environments, and you can see it created when we create the mock server test flicks with the URL and the value. And also you can see we've now got a mock server, which is test flicks, a mock server which is test flicks, sorry. So if we go back now to the collections and we click on send for this request, we can see that we got back a 200 OK. But what about if we now want to call this endpoint again, but to sort of mock a different response? So what we can do now is we can click here and we can click on add example. And now what we can do is we can say, let's get a new response, and this will return back a 404, not found. So let's save that, and we'll say the response is error, for example. Now let's go to the ping endpoint again and click on send. So now we're just getting 404 error coming back because that was the first example within this collection. Let's rename this to 404, and let's rename ping to 202, sorry, 200 even, for OK. Let's send the request again. So it's still returning 404. So how can we now, within our examples for this endpoint, for the mock endpoint, how can we get it to return back the status code that we want? So within the GET request, if we go to headers, Postman has a concept of X mock response code or response name. So you can either say, I want to pull back the mock response by the status code that the example has, or by the name. So we've called this 404 and 200. So now I'm going to say, return back the response code 200, or the example 200, and there you see we've got the 200 back. And then if we were to change this to 404, then we get the 404 back error. So that's great if we want to start to send requests and get responses back for the same endpoint. But what about if we want to start to use parameters? So for this, let's create a new endpoint, a new request, sorry. And we're going to call this speaker. So here we need to copy the URL again, and what we're going to do is we're going to say we're going to get speaker by ID, and it's going to be get request, and we're going to add an example. So here this is going to return back a 200, okay, and we're going to return maybe the ID that was passed to this request, and we're going to return maybe the first name, and I'll just put my name for now, and last name. And we'll just save that example. So now if we click on the GET request and we click on send, what happens? So you see that it returned 200 and it returned my first and last name, but we've got this weird thing here where it doesn't know what to do with the ID. So now what we can do is, we're saying that this is a parameter called ID. And we're saying within the example, we're going to pass an ID and then just use it here. So if we go back and we click on send, now you see the ID is being passed through. So every time that we make the request and we change that ID, the ID is just passed through, which is quite nice. So we could take this a little bit further. So Postman has a concept of dynamic variables. So what we could do is we could say name, maybe. So we could say random first name. So let's copy that. And let's put that in our example. And let's go random last name as well, just to try and make this quite nice. And let's see what happens. Sorry, these brackets are really important. Just add this in. So let's make that request and see what happens. Cool. So now we have an endpoint where every time we send a request off, it's dynamic, which is quite nice to be able to test the responses coming back. But what about, so I mentioned that I could pass through different IDs and the data's dynamic, which is great. But what about when we get to the speaker whose ID is maybe 5? We want to return back a 404 just for that ID. So here you'll see that we've got a request, which is to the endpoint for speaker and then just dynamic ID. If we were to just copy this and we put this to 5, and then if we were to keep that as ID, or actually we could just put speaker not found maybe, and we'll return a 404 not found. Okay. So what we've got again, we've got a URL where we pass an ID, but when we pass a number 5, we're expecting 404 not found. So let's make that request to number 4 again, make sure we haven't broken anything. Number 3 maybe, number 6, and then number 5. So there you have it. What we can start to do, we can mock requests and responses by calling the exact same endpoint, but we can tell what status code to return back. Or we can mock responses where we can say for particular parameters, we want to return back certain responses. So that was just a brief look at Postman and the power of mocking, and I really hope it's given you a few ideas of how you can start the test API sooner. Thanks again for joining this session. Enjoy the rest of your day.